Hey, all you hedge fund babies, give us some money. This week we're kind of doing something quite timely. We're only like 9 months behind the actual trend of talking about COVID. So we're kind of doing this little episode about arts funding, of which we of course accept none.
Nobody as cool as us arrives at a party on time. Okay, so everybody's been talking about COVID for 6 months. We're just about on schedule, given how effortlessly cool we are.
Look out for the MySpace update coming later on this year. So yeah, just to ask for this every week.
Do you hear that feminine laugh? That wasn't David, funnily enough.
It was not David.
We're joined by a special guest this week, our sometimes heckler, sometimes contributor, Vicki Henry. Vicki, hi.
Yeah, sorry about that. Hi, you've been on the receiving end of those heckles more times than you care to remember, I'm sure.
Yep, I'm blocking it. Mark, do you want to throw ourselves at the mercy of capitalism?
Yeah, so hey, all you hedge fund babies. going to go down that route again.
Do you think anybody involved in a hedge fund actually listens to us?
I think it's exclusively people that run hedge funds that listen to our podcast.
Funnily enough, I was in Edinburgh a couple of weeks ago, and I was getting a coffee and a donut, and there were 2 student age girls serving, one of whom was American, and she turned around to the other girl and she's like, I don't feel like I ever use math in real life. And then the other girl, who was English, said, oh, well, I never actually used it until I got an internship at a hedge fund last year. So that's where they are. They're all in Edinburgh.
Welcome to fucking Edinburgh. That's standard for an Edinburgh coffee, isn't it?
Yeah, pretty much.
I mean, just say that living in the West End of Glasgow, which is getting pretty close. Yeah, I mean, this is going to be an ironic cash cow given what we're about to talk about. Do you think so, Mark?
I do think so, yes. So we occasionally do some things on Patreon. You get early access to episodes, and we do bonus content and stuff, and all the money we get from that helps us to stay afloat and helps us to not throw ourselves at the mercy of advertisers, which we would like to keep doing for as long as we humanly possibly can. So if you have a little spare in your pocket right now, go to patreon.com/unsungpod. Starts from as little as $2. It will eventually be £2. I think it's actually at the start of November it'll move over to £. So by the time this comes out, it might actually already be £. Now I think about it. But anyway, yeah, if you like cool stuff, please go and give us some of your cash. We've got a lot of cool tiers and all that, and you know we do stuff. We make some awesome t-shirts, by the way. Just saying.
Don't make us go cap in hand to the government because of tax and that's chuff.
So on that point, what are we talking about this week? We're not talking about albums and music or anything. This is your idea, Chris.
It is kind of my idea because we do think we're not just eye candy and
ear candy.
Okay, obviously, global pandemic. So this is to some extent relevant to everybody in the world, and clearly most people listening to this podcast have more than a passing interest in music and wider arts. So we kind of want to talk about that a little bit. We want to talk about the impact it's had a little bit. But I think I specifically want to focus on the push now for the support for the arts. But I'm just curious now when I hear all these cries for funding, like, who is it that's making the cries? Because of the circumstances, there's not a lot of like really critical questions being asked, which seems on the face of it, I mean, how could you possibly disagree with wanting to keep the arts strong and keep it funded and help support all the people involved in it through what's, I can tell you firsthand, as can David, as probably can Mark, it's a very, very difficult time, you know. That is my livelihood. I love it. Music especially is probably the biggest thing in my life, apart from relentless self-loathing. By the way, I should apologise in advance. We're going to conflate music and art. A lot of what we're going to say is applicable across the board, and we'll try and make that distinction when we can, but for the purposes of the conversation and because of the nature of the podcast, we'll probably focus on music. But I think there are some interesting voices or perspectives not maybe being heard, and that's maybe a polite way of me saying I'm going to spend a lot of this podcast, I think, being something of a devil's advocate. We'll try and make it pretty entertaining, I think, but there are some real points to be had here, and hopefully it gives people a more that sounds a little bit condescending, so I don't want to say it will give you a more balanced perspective, but it will maybe help you look past that very sort of superficial narrative of, hey, we should just be helping everybody right now, come on government, dig deep. To try and internationalise this a bit as well before we get into the weeds of it, Mark, you'd mentioned about the UK's cultural footprint being really, really huge, and it is. I mean, coming from Glasgow as well, we've got a ridiculously disproportionate reputation for music. It's crazy, like this area of Scotland in general, and the UK definitely has a far bigger influence on the world's music scene, and especially historically really did, than it probably should have, certainly based on population. Funnily enough, it's not the highest ratio of cultural capital
output per capita.
That actually goes to Italy. Italy's the one that has the highest ratio, but for whatever reason Italy's economy is that much smaller that it doesn't quite equate. So yeah, I mean, we're huge, and in the whole of the EU we apparently have lost the most already. It's apparently like 10% of the entire industry it's shrunk by, which is, you know, maybe that statistic doesn't necessarily convey how big an impact that actually has, but that is massive. And so there's huge calls here. I don't know what it's like for our listeners elsewhere, because I'm mindful when I'm doing this that we've got listeners from far-flung different areas, but I'm sure you're all having your equivalent struggles. For us in the UK, it's a really, really big deal. It's a huge part of our economy, and we've really, really felt it. So yeah, I think we need to kind of parse that. We need to pull that apart and look at it in a wee bit more depth and give it a little bit more context, which all sounds very dry. It isn't as dry as it sounds. Vicki is, apart from being a huge music fan, Vicki is an educator of young minds, and I think that's really significant here. Vicki, you and I spoke about this at some length prior to the show.
Yeah.
Was that a pleasant interaction for you?
All I can say is thank God we've been friends for as long as we have, because I think we can get away with like getting into some kind of like testy territory and getting quite passionate about things. But it was an interesting topic for me to discuss, because I think like the way you and I were talking about it, we're from like completely different perspectives looking at it as well, and sometimes it's quite hard to actually have a discussion about it, because even like your general definitions of things probably differ, and you don't really know if you're talking about what it means to you is the same thing as it means to me, and all of that kind of stuff. I don't know if you know what I'm getting at when I'm saying that. Yeah,
there's definitely stuff that we take for granted that we need to clarify, but we'll dive into it. I think it's probably the best way to do it. Mark, you'd written a wee comment on art as a career. Now, this is what we're talking about really. COVID has hugely impacted upon the arts. It's hugely impacted upon that entire ecosphere of venues, artists, theatres, writers, journalists, all the people that are further down that food chain. And I guess the first thing that really made me think about this was, and actually I want to give credit where it's due, it's going back to a Steve Albini interview on a DVD called DIY or Die.
Your life is only that with which has its way with you.
Where he described the quote hubristic presumption that you think you can be in this case a professional musician, that you think you can make a living from people just wanting to pay for your art. This is going to rub a lot of people up the wrong way. But what were your thoughts on artist career, Mark? Because you seem pretty positive on it.
I don't know if I'd go that far. I mean, I think when we first started discussing this, one of the first things I said is I think for a lot, the way that I look at it, because I've been told I come across as quite an optimistic person, but I don't think I am. my view on this is quite pessimistic. I think it's a bit of like a sheer folly to presume that you can make a career as an artist. All four of us know how hard that is to do, and how rewarding it can be if you do it right, and how much grind and how much craft and how much you need to put in to make that happen. Obviously, without people who have made a career out of art, we wouldn't be here talking about any of the stuff we've been doing for the past almost 150 episodes. But everything in society is kind of set against people doing that. Yeah, it still happens anyway, you know. Obviously, I'm hugely biased because of what the things I studied at uni as well, but because of where I live and because of the fertile music scene that we happen to be part of. But Scotland in and of itself has got quite a huge cultural footprint for a country of its size. And although it might be quite difficult to make a career out of art, there's still no shortage of artists and places for artists to go and, you know, sell their wares, for lack of a better term. So I'm kind of on two sides of the fence on that one, I suppose. There's also this huge part of me that's like, well, my mum used to always say to me that being in a band was a pipe dream, and I still, even though I'm fucking 35, right, I'm still want to prove her wrong, even though I'm never going to do that. So I hate that attitude as well. I think that attitude's totally bullshit too. I think you can do it, you know. But
but let's give your mum some credit there. She's got a point.
Yeah, I know
she does have a point. Now, but let's talk a wee bit about why your mum has a point there, okay? I mean, so I'd kind of looked into the economics of it, right? And I think it's kind of useful to go through this first, right? There was a famous sort of like hubbub maybe about 10 years ago when this study by a guy called Simon Price was reported in, what was it? It was the Daily Mail did a big thing on it, and a few other publications. Oh, it was a magazine called The Word, or Word, which is gone now, actually. They misreported this, but long and short of it is that Simon Price he's from a working background, he'd been working class background. He was curious about this trend in pop music that seemed to be an awful lot of privately educated musicians that were succeeding at it. He went through historic top 20s. I think he went back to the 90s, the 1990s specifically originally, and he found that, I think from a study, that about 1% of the top 20 at a given point was privately educated. I think it was one member of one group in the top 20. Now, when compared with 2010, what his figures actually showed was that the top 20 was about, at that stage, about 25 to 30% privately educated. The misreporting appeared, I don't know where the figure came from, but it was misreported as 60%, and it's actually something that's stuck with me for too long. But long story short, though, that's a massive increase. We're talking about the UK here. About 7% of people in the UK are privately educated, but then you've got upwards of 25% of the charts dominated by that. Now, it gets even worse when you go into things like the Brit Awards. There were some really interesting studies about those. I think it was 19% of Brit winners since 1977 have been privately educated. Considering, though, that's since 1977, so this is something that's really accelerated in this century. And in classical Brit Awards, and this probably isn't a big surprise, but we should ask ourselves about this, 76% of people that have won classical Brit Awards are privately educated. And actually, as it happens, 60% of British Oscar winners are privately educated. 42% of British BAFTA winners are privately educated. The arts is not a level playing field. The arts hasn't been a level playing field for forever, really. Your mum saying to you it's a pipe dream, your mum has a point, because in your lifetime, and from your background and my background and our background, I think generally, it's not a viable option. It really isn't. It does happen. There are exceptions, but statistically, it's not. It actually was, to some extent, a much more viable option in the 90s, as is evidenced, you know, and then going back, music used to be a much more working class thing. And I think what this is going to bring us onto is the notion of high art and low art, and how funding is distributed, and also why the panic now. Why the sudden... I mean, clearly, I know why the panic now. Again, I'm being rhetorical, but this is a crisis that's been affecting working class musicians and lower class musicians and creators and artists and dancers and anybody aspiring to succeed in this realm for decades and decades and decades. It's not a new thing for us. And so there's a little bit of... I don't want to cut off my nose to spite my face. I am really perturbed by the current situation, but there's also a little bit of schadenfreude, because you sort of sense that the people that worked the system, the people that the system was very much stacked in their favour for a long, long time, are now starting to feel a lot of the fiscal realities that faced everybody else. And I think that's a really fascinating consequence of this environment. I think it is, on one hand, again, like straddling the issue. On one hand, it's sad, it's troubling, it's problematic, but on another hand, it is interesting, and it does you do wonder, maybe it's overly optimistic, does this present an opportunity to bring this issue to the fore, that there is a dramatic lack of support, not for the arts generally, but certainly for the lower tiers of society trying to access the arts?
So this is something I think that has to do with, like, it comes down to a purely economic structure of supply and demand, and this is how music has changed over the last 50 years, because I think there were some working class bands that made it in the 70s, and there were some privately educated bands that made it in the 70s.
Yeah, like
overall,
Genesis.
yeah, overall it was more,
Genesis went to a school that was 20 grand a year.
Well,
They met at, was it called Chapter House, whatever it's called?
That's why
overall
Phil calls
it was overall it was more difficult to make music then. It was more difficult to buy instruments, it was more difficult to get together and practice, it was more difficult to tour and eventually get signed, and what there was a viable living for those that jumped through all those hoops. So there were less people making music of a standard, but of those people, a larger percentage were able to make a living. What's happened since, and particularly in the advent of the internet and home recording, is that the number of people making good music has exploded exponentially. The demand for music has remained about the same, but the supply has increased hugely, so therefore the value has gone down. Yes, there are more ways to listen to music, and basically if you work for a record label now, what you're trying to do is ike more demand. Your job is trying to get syncs and try to get songs on films and stuff like that, because there are only the same amount of people pretty much that are buying records nowadays than there were 50 years ago, but there are 1,000 times more home producers and bands and people like that. So I think what's happened is musicians and artists have seen decades of music being viable if you make it, but now it's harder to make it to that level because there's 1,000 times more people doing the same quality of stuff. So there was
definitely a historic, even back in sort of early, was it 2003, 2004, I think, was the first really noticeable precipice of income from music, when the sort of exponentially started to decline as the internet and broadband speeds or internet speeds increased and streaming and things like that started to take hold. And you notice that the erosion of the middle class in music. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the working class in a musical sense, the working class of music. The middle class of music was this. So many of your favourite bands would have been middle class of music, bands that were not rich, they were not going to the Seychelles, they were not shooting videos that cost $1 million, they were not appearing even on certainly TV shows, they were, but or maybe they were once or twice. Your Guided by Voices, your Girls Against Boys from the 90s, those kind of level of acts. They weren't the Nirvanas, they weren't the headline bands, but they were there and they were making a sustainable living for a long time, and they could be musicians and they could work at it. And that seems to be the area that has been eroded, and it's become much more drastically, you either break through and make it on a certain level or you don't. That middle class of music has been eroded, and I think even just culturally, we don't have time to go into it, but the middle class is what's under threat culturally as income disparity increases. You got the upper class profits to greater extents, and the gulf becomes bigger, and that's what we've seen happening in music as well, as a mirror on society in that way.
Yeah, because a lot of your bands who would be in that middle class are the bands that have to put the graft in to actually make the ends meet, and that is literally impossible right now.
I think what I'm trying to do is paint a little bit of a picture for people who see music in a more passive way, who aren't as involved in it, who don't maybe appreciate the class dynamic of it. I'm really sorry if that sounds condescending. I don't mean it to be. I'm just saying this is something I work with, and it's something I'm confronted with all the time, and I really see this starkly portrayed in a lot of situations. And you know what a lot of workplaces then don't have in common is the next bit of the conversation, which is subsidy and finance for these higher end things. What is it that's helping to create that disparity? What is it that's fostering that disparity? Why, for example, in classical music is there such an outrageous disparity? I mean, 76%, you know, that's higher than the percentage of judges that are from privately educated backgrounds. That is just, that's wild to me. Vicki, you know Sandy Shaw, don't you?
The folk singer? Aye.
Yeah. So always something there to remind me, Sandy Shaw. She actually testified to a culture select committee in 2013 about this trend. I'm not sure why Sandy Shaw is such an activist in it. Maybe she does come from a kind of lower class, a working class background, but she testified about how hard it was becoming to succeed, that income was becoming such a barrier. And she also actually made an interesting point that a lot of the people without a safety net are more inclined, even if they do get a deal, to accept inferior deals. It was her experience in her research that desperation, you know, taking the first train out of town, you know, they were taking an offer, they weren't able, for example, to access as competent legal advice, or they weren't able to access any legal advice. They were reading their own contracts, negotiating their own contracts, just working on much tighter margins. And so she was saying this income disparity is not just affecting the amount of people that get their opportunity to break through, but it's affecting the quality of the opportunity that they get when it does come, if it comes.
Don't you think like that's a problem with like capitalism in general? Because like when you mentioned that stuff about Steve Albini at the beginning, what was it he said, that it was hubristic folly or something like that? To me, there's a
hubristic presumption. Right.
Okay. I think there's like, to me, whenever, maybe I've picked you up wrong, Chris, right? And apologies if this is this misrepresents you, but when we've been talking before, I had more of the impression that you had a certain level of disdain. You thought it was a kind of freeloading kind of, like I said before we come on here, like welfare for the cultural elite that were taking the kind of the funding. And to me, these kind of problems where it's like issues of like people at the bottom not getting rights, not accessing good opportunities, are just like problems for every workplace. And I don't know, are you trying to say there's like inherently having a career as an artist is not something people should do from a kind of moral point of view? Like I don't, do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, you're not wrong, mm-hmm. on my opinion, more widely. Well, you're paraphrasing it, but yeah, I think I used the analogy with you guys before this, right? If in any country, but especially in the UK in our situation, a giant bag of cash landed on the table tomorrow, it was handed over by the government, just with a tag in it saying arts and music, where does that money go? And this is the thing that's really been sticking in my craw, because I don't see that money being handed out in some sort of egalitarian manner where people that need it across the board get access to it. What I think is a much likelier scenario is the people that are used to funding, who need funding to sustain their way of life, are going to expect that they're entitled to that. We'll talk about why that is. And the people who were creating without ever having had funding are going to be told, well, you guys have never really needed this, have you? You know, you can totally just keep doing what you're doing. The indie bands, the grime artists, the hip hop people, the bedroom electronica producers, like you guys are okay. You don't need it. You don't need to dip into this, because the problem is there's so many of them. That's part of the issue. Is that if every indie band took $100, that pile would start to shrink fast. And I think that is what I'm concerned about. We are not talking about an equal. I'm not trying to get too socialist about it, but I just want us to have an honest conversation here. We're not talking about an equal distribution of wealth to help encourage arts and music. We're talking about propping up a system that is completely uneven, and that's why I brought in all the statistics about, the charts and the culture sectors earlier on. This is an imbalanced system, and this is what we're talking about propping up. We're talking about perpetuating an imbalance. We're not talking about redressing a balance. Discuss.
So I mean, I think I can talk from experience here, because I worked for Creative Scotland for 4 years, and I was involved in, you know, the grassroots part of funding and finding musicians and artists, and there was a weird sort of philosophical conundrum at the heart of Creative Scotland. So for those outside of Scotland, Creative Scotland is like the Arts Council, and it's a sort of arm's length organisation that funds all art and artists, apart from, you know, like the big like the orchestras and the operas and stuff like that. 60% of its funding comes from Scottish Government, and 40% of its funding comes from the National Lottery. Now, I mean, that's a whole other area that we can go down. The National Lottery is funded by mostly working class folk looking to, you know, get out of poverty. Do they realise that, you know, a bunch of that is going to then fund a ballet class in Newton Mearns? But yeah, Creative Scotland was a very interesting organisation to be part of. Because
Dave, sorry, sorry to break your flow there, man, but something you seized on that I want to highlight as you go on. You said the orchestra was 60% funded by Creative Scotland or government grants, is that right?
No, Creative Scotland was funded 60% by the government and 40% by National Lottery.
Right, okay.
So, sorry, I meant, to be clear, there were some larger cultural organisations like Scottish National Orchestra, etc., that were funded directly by the government and bypassed Creative Scotland.
So I'm really curious about that. And before you take the floor again, they weren't funded by door sales, they weren't funded by merch sales, they weren't funded by CD sales, or... Well,
they were, but I mean, that's something that's like the high art versus low art thing. There are just a certain number of basically, you know, sacred cows that are set up as high culture that can kind of... They do make money, but they don't cover themselves. You know, all opera houses and all operas around the world are subsidised because not enough people go to the opera, and the opera isn't open to working class folk to be able to afford it either.
Which is amazing.
Could I just add something here, just to be a bit flippant? Do you know what happens in when it comes to, you know, evolution? It just gets fucking killed, right? Like, that's it.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
It just dies, like if it can.
Cultural Darwinism.
Sorry, my understanding as well is that some of these like business, these like opera houses or theatres or whatever, they are subsidised because like although they're maybe not like covering their asses in like ticket sales or whatever, they're bringing in a wider economy to the like local area in other ways as well, and that when things like that get shut down, it is devastating to the local economy and the people, the businesses round about those establishments. Do you know what I mean? So that's why they do subsidise them as well.
Yeah, I get that, but I think that's a wee bit cheap because we don't subsidise football teams or go-kart racing, or the audience for a bowling alley, I would imagine, is probably up there with the audience for an opera based on cultural appeal. We don't subsidise bowling alleys because they contribute to the local economy. I think I get that point, but I think it's the sort of thing you write into an application for funding rather than it having much real, in terms of real world impact. I mean,
but like, to me, it's fine that a civilised society should aim to fund the arts, because art is something that separates humanity as a species. It's like we're able to appreciate beauty and garner meaning from our surroundings, you know. So being able to do so is both an effect and a cause of civilization reaching a point of success, that we're not having to just make sure that we don't all starve and kill ourselves.
Right.
We have reached a point of appreciating beauty, and that is what separates art from bowling.
Well, as long as we acknowledge that involves inherent cultural privilege, right? Because to suggest that art has to be sustained by funding, I think, is a little bit absurd, given that that's got to be the exception to the rule on a global scale. Okay, you're right, we do live in a culture where it's nice that we can do that, and it's nice that we can encourage diversity in that way. But I mean, let's be honest, that the world is absolutely full of cultures where there is nothing in place, or certainly not to the same extent or anything like the same extent, to deliberately fund the arts. Art is something that is created by people. I mean, I think that's the point Albini was making in his own way. Art is created by artists who want to create art. Art is something that people want to consume, and it's something that will be created whether it's funded or not. What we are talking about is disproportionately loading the dice so that certain arts can function smoothly despite the fact there's no demand, or next to no demand, in a kind of market scale if you compare them to like indie or low art. You know?
Mm-hmm. But what you're talking about there, you're saying art is created, but I don't think that just the creation of something is the remit of like organisations like Creative Scotland, and that was something that a point I was trying to make when I was discussing this with you before, is that where I see arts funding in my profession is in like outreach and engagement and things like that. It's not just about the creation of a product or a show or whatever, you know, it is about fulfilling a role in lots of different aspects of communities. So I think it's difficult to paint the arts with such a broad stroke like that, because there's so much work that gets done with arts funding that isn't necessarily creating a product. Do you know what I mean?
Well, can I interject there, because that is interesting, and I took that on board from when we'd spoken previously. So if you go back again to 1990 when Price did that initial study of the charts, okay, there was local authorities in the UK that year, if you round it, I think you round it down, it was £100 million in what would you call it, music provision, I think is the official name for what they were providing to the communities. Music provision, you know, trying to help people have access to music if that was something they wanted to do that they otherwise wouldn't have access to. By the way, I got that figure from the Daily Mail as well. This is the second time I've cited the Daily Mail. I don't spend a lot of time reading the Daily Mail. Or maybe I do. Like, so, I mean, it's my birthday soon. You
have to start calling all artists lovies if you're citing the Daily Mail.
Moving to the right as I get older. But the thing is, as of 2010, when he did the second part of that study, and not even adjusting for inflation, it was half of that was getting spent. So 20 years later, half of the output. So we're talking about all this money that we're spending on arts funding to outreach and help the community. Well, that has been dropping to the extent that it's now at 50%, even if you don't take into account the fact that the pound itself is worth less. And then if you look at it, some of those local authorities had a budget of £1.15 annually for music outreach to community, to children, and that is insane. And some of those, by the way, since 2010 have probably dropped to zero if you take in austerity cuts. This is the UK, again, don't want to lose too many people here, but a bit like the thing about opera houses helping their local community, it's a lot of hot air in my book. I'm sorry, but I think it's a lot of hot air. All this noise about art being like us piling money into funding communities and helping.
You're saying that because they've cut money from these things and therefore they're not happening, that they're bad? What? I don't understand your point.
No,
it comes back to high art and low art, right? That's kind of the issue here. It's like, why be funding more X and why?
What I'm saying is that this incredible amount of funding for the arts has never been there, and this ties back in to my initial point. Why this sudden panic? That we have this COVID panic where we're told, oh my God, the kids aren't getting access to music now. They were getting £1.15 a fucking year. That's not even a replacement E-string, alright? We're getting this sudden panic about, we've got no funding for bands, we've got no funding for young musicians. This is
but I think what we've seen is...
Hang on 2 seconds. This is the DIY angle, right? I've never had that fucking access to funding, or actually that's not strictly true, because there are a couple of times I've had access, and I'm kind of the exception to that rule. I've applied to Creative Scotland and been supported to some extent, okay, but that is also far from the majority of cases, okay. But DIY music, indie music, grime, young artists in, you know, housing schemes, that's just never been there. So what I'm trying to say is, who is it we're hearing this huge call globally in all these different countries, not just the UK? Who is it that's making the call? And the people that are making the call, and what I'm putting forward here in my slightly devil's advocate, but maybe not as much devil's advocate as I think it is that it's the people at the top that are panicking. It's the people who are accustomed to a way of life. It's the people that are accustomed to having their opera, their folk music subsidised, their jazz music music subsidised, their organisation subsidised, their intermediary agent subsidised, their record label is struggling because they spent years taking lines and living off the fat of the land, and now after something of a decline, they're experiencing a precipitous decline. These are the people that I'm really hearing calling out. I'm not hearing indie musicians calling out for funding because they've never expected to get it. They could have called out till they were blue in the face. They would never have got it. Kids would never have got it. They were getting £1.15 a year, if that. What I'm saying is, the reason we are hearing so much these campaigns are going around on the internet, who is it that's fucking behind these? And the reason they're so high profile is because the people at the top are making them high profile. Grassroots campaigns have never got fucking anywhere. The DIY scene has always been ignored. The reason we are seeing these hashtags, the reason we're seeing these adverts, the reason we're hearing about it in Parliament is because people with fucking money and something to lose are worried. And that's my point. This is not an altruistic thing that we're watching, and whilst it's a problem for me and for you, David, and for people that we like, that I have a lot of time for, I'm also very aware of a little bit of me that does want to just fucking watch it all burn, because for decades now they have not given a fuck about the people at the bottom and about adversity.
But I think that's what the issue is that the funding has been cut and grassroots things and DIY things aren't getting the funding that they should, and then
they've never had that.
No, there has been, and there are organisations out there that are always trying to do things like that, but they don't have enough funding. And then it's like you speak to people that are working for local theatre groups or working in little venues, and they're always just trying to scrape by and do what they can, and buy a new bass amp for the band practice and stuff like that. But that funding is gradually getting cut, and councils are getting less money, and these grassroots things are getting less money. And then what's happened with COVID is the entire industry is completely fucked, and it's put the tin lid on 20 years of cuts and 10 years of austerity. Yeah, there's some middle class folk out there going, I'm not going to be able to do my pottery thing, but
buy my espadrilles.
Yeah, but there are also real grassroots, proper DIY musicians and community organisers and groups out there that have seen decades of cuts, and then this happens.
Right,
which just completely fucks it.
I take that on board, but I don't think that bears out in reality. That venue you're talking about in that analogy about the bass amp, that venue was never getting that bass amp bought for them. And let's go to a subject.
But because I've seen there are, but just because they haven't doesn't mean they shouldn't. But B, also
they never have.
They have. I have been to places where a venue in a little village in the Highlands, and they get 300 quid of funding that then buys a crappy little drum kit and a bass amp and a guitar, and that means that local bands can go in and use it as a practice space.
Meanwhile, the National Orchestra is funded entirely. That is exactly my point. That little £300 of crappy drum kits and a crappy bass amp is the £1.15 a kid outreach.
Yeah, but
tokenism.
What I'm saying is
tokenism.
But what I'm saying is there should be more of that. But even that 300 quid is getting taken away, and that venue might not exist because of COVID. So what you've got is a whole class of people, a generation or a class of people that have got used to living on scraps, but now those scraps aren't even there.
I take that on board. I think that's got some truth, but let's be clear, that venue first and foremost never felt entitled to get that bass amp. Okay, this hypothetical venue never felt entitled in anything like the same way as the National Orchestra of Scotland knew that annually its funding would be renewed. That is a completely different universe of funding. You're talking about one specific abstract example of a small place. You're probably right, getting one budget drum kit and one budget thing, and then a local MP probably using that, waving that about to try and get re-elected, versus high art getting funded to the tune of 6-7 figures on a rolling basis year after year after year without even having to fucking justify it. And what I'm saying is that venue is not the one leading the charge of where is our funding, this is all drying up. Those venues have learned to survive on next to nothing.
Yeah, but so what's your point? They should now learn to live on nothing rather than next to nothing.
they've been left to capitalism. The orchestra, as Mark was saying about cultural Darwinism, the orchestras have never been left to capitalism. The jazz bars have not been left to capitalism in the same way. The folk scene has not been left to capitalism in the same way. The interpretive dance scene, somebody fucking performing like some one-person show to like the machine gun scene from Scarface in front of like 8 people at the fucking tramway, that is not even comparable with the 18, 20 indie bands that come out of one little town, never get anything, never get anywhere, but they make that music regardless of knowing they're never going to get any rewards. What I'm saying is there's a whole world of people who are used to making art with no financial reward. They're used to making art because they want to make art, and they make it as long as they can. They quite often operate at a loss. And I think the analogy I would use is these people who, like myself in the DIY scene, artists who've ploughed very, very unrewarding furrows, we're the cockroaches of this arts apocalypse. We're the people that have lived on nothing, less than nothing, sometimes paying to make our product, watching grants go over our heads, watching things get shut down, no security, no living wages, and we're the only people that are equipped to outlast that. You know, if the money isn't there, we'll still be making it, just like in countries where the funding bodies aren't there. They're still making music, they're still making art, they're still making theatre as they can. I don't want it to be like that. That's what I'm saying. That's why I'm saying it's a slightly devil's advocate kind of point of view. But it is fascinating to watch the absolute hysteria of people that are so used to having things their own way, of groups and organisations and structures that are so used to constant funding and bankrolling, suddenly being brought down to earth with a thump and said, this is how we make art. We make art at a loss sometimes. We make it with a vain hope of one day succeeding. We make it because we need to make it, and we make it as long as we can before having a kid or becoming an alcoholic or fucking dying of fucking cancer stops us. And that is the reality for the majority of musicians, I would say, in this country, not the minority, and yet it's inverted when it comes to the funding. And I think this situation should shine a light on that, and it's not doing that because it's been portrayed as a sort of altruistic call for support for arts. That call has never been there. It's never been there before. It's entirely disingenuous in my book. That's my point. So
go to patreon.com/unsungpod.
It's capitalism. That is capitalism. This is the thing. That is this is the dark inverse of capitalism, is that people that profited from it for so long, the record labels, are now experiencing both the downturn at the start, like the 2000s, and now they're experiencing this, and they're fucking freaking out. I mean, Dave, you know as well as I do as well, like the system, this is maybe a little eye opener for listeners. If you want to release a record yourself now, to get it reviewed, you have to join a subscription site to try and get it into the hands of journalists, probably about 50% of the time now. To then get it a response from those journalists, it costs you money. They do it in this token system, which is really common now over here, right? You then get sent a thing saying, if you want us to write a review, that'll be 15 quid. If you want us to do an interview, that'll be 30 quid, 40 quid. You are paying a journalist to do their job. You are paying for the luxury of having your music covered by gatekeepers. The gatekeepers are in there, but the gatekeepers also want funded. They also want subsidised. By the way, a really interesting stat that didn't come up earlier on, more than 50% of UK working journalists are privately educated. This is a system that is built to sustain itself. It's not a system that's out there for the good of it.
Well, the system of music journalism, though, because people used to buy music magazines and now they don't, so they're working with less money and they're working within a capitalist system, so their companies are getting bought over and people are getting made redundant, and there's less staff. So the problem is capitalism, Chris, at every level.
Yeah, you know what? That's the thing.
That was a big Scooby-Doo reveal moment there.
My politics degree hasn't been wasted.
And they would have gotten away with it too if it wasn't for us pesky kids. No, but honestly, I get what you're saying about the magazines, okay? But the thing is, the magazines always set themselves up as intermediaries anyway, as gatekeepers. But at least at a point, they were doing a job. They were rewarded based on the quality of the journalism. It is now literally paid for content. It always was going that way. Advertisers always got priority over non-advertisers. As an independent band, you couldn't be guaranteed a fair shake. But now, even as an independent, you are being told, if you even want covered, you have to pay us. And they justify it by saying, oh, we need to stay in a job. Well, why the fuck do you need to stay in a job if your job is simply publishing and reviewing the things that you're paid to review? What is your job anymore? What is your role? This entire system is totally farcical, and I think none more so than the notion of high art, low art, and the way they're funded, and the sense of entitlement that this situation has revealed. Like this, the way that people feel entitled to get funded to be professional musicians, when the vast majority of musicians have been absolutely labouring to just for the privilege of making the thing that was inside them a reality for decades. And yeah, you're right. I mean, I don't have any solutions. I just think it's fucking amazing as well as really sad. It's both sad and grimly glorious to watch the people that created the system that disenfranchised so many suddenly freak out.
So I've got a question. So are you saying that you agree with the rationale behind arts funding, but you just think it's not being distributed fairly, or do you just not agree with arts funding?
I fundamentally...
This is where you decide if you're a communist or a libertarian.
I know. Nail your colours to the flag, or whatever the expression is.
I'm an anarcho-fascist.
I've got Alex Jones on one phone and I've got fucking Zizek on the other. Come on, man, tell us where we're going here.
Who's got the more annoying voice? I fundamentally think that art funding can play a role, and I think art funding, Vicky, should be going in the direction of you guys. I think art funding should be going hugely in the direction of enabling people access to it to see if it's something they want to do, to give in their initial openings. This idea of arts funding, the bespoke nature of it, which me and David have talked about, and actually me and Dave, despite him working at Creative Scotland, are on a lot of the same pages about this. In France, you've got this initiative called Intermittent, Vicky? Intermittent de Spectacle?
Yeah, spectacle is like show.
Oh, I've missed your French accent, Chris.
Yeah, no, it's fucking terrible. But I mean, the way that works was to get artists that were performing a certain amount of hours, a certain amount of shows a year, a guaranteed minimum income, which to me seems a much fairer way of incentivising people who really want to pursue something and enabling them to do it, rather than paying chunks of money to people who have the right connections and know the right people and have the education to submit application forms. That's another thing. The application process is, by its very nature, by its bureaucratic nature, quite prohibitive. And this is not
absolutely. I totally agree with that. Yeah, I mean, much of this just has to do with voting the right people in. It's political and downwards. I guess you've got to have the conversations so that politicians know what to talk about. And 10 years of Tory rule, it's not going to lead to a progressive arts funding programme.
Yeah, but you know what? I would push back against that a bit. It's not just the Tories, man. It's people. It's human nature. If people had been paying for their music, for example, if people had applied this notion of intrinsic value to music and art all the time, they would have been compensating the people that were creating it for their pleasure, and they've not. The fact is, there is a lot of art out there that we can still enjoy. It exists in hard copy form. If you'd been buying it in hard copy form or in any real form directly from the artist, then they wouldn't be in such a precarious position. But you haven't. And that's not the Tories.
People are still going to gigs though, and COVID has stopped that.
Not nearly as much as they used to. And let's be honest, like, the gig system has become so dependent on PR. The small venues that used to be rammed, 13th Notes and that, they're not rammed anymore. People aren't going out to discover artists, they're waiting for it to be put in front of them. And to get in front of them, you have to pay the gatekeepers. There's no way to escape that. It's a complete catch-22 situation, the way it's evolved, and now it's collapsing. I mean,
that's because it's been commodified by the system.
Yeah, so. But this glib thing of blaming Tories, I fucking hate the Tories as much as the next guy, right? But you can't blame the Tories.
I'm not blaming Tories for that, I'm blaming the system.
I mean, the toys went out the pram because of that retrain campaign. I don't think that's the problem. I think our lack of awareness and understanding and examination of our own actions and the devaluing of art in general is a much, much bigger problem, and we're all responsible for that, not the Tories.
Yeah, agree. Well, how do we sum this up?
Vicky, how do we fix it? Come on, that's why we brought you here, to fix it.
Oh no, don't ask me, I don't know. I don't know, because I believe in arts funding. Like, I have I think is a positive thing. I think it's going to potentially do really good things. I think that there's still room as well for things that don't necessarily have a social kind of they're not there to as an outreach or whatever. I think there is room for just art for art's sake as well. I'm one of those people but I think that
you don't want the government funding your punk music, you mean? Fucking hell.
But for me, I believe in funding artists. I believe that if an artist had projected at the start of the crisis that they were going to make X amount of money, and then the crisis happened and they have been disadvantaged economically because of that, then I think, like any other worker, the government should look after them. That's kind of my point of view on that. I don't think they're entitled to it just because they're an artist. I just think it's a job like any other job, and I don't think jobs are inherently good or bad or anything. Do you know what I mean? Like, I just think it's a necessary thing that has to happen just now because there's an unpredictable situation that is affecting everybody's livelihoods. But going forward, I definitely think there's room for reform in arts funding. I just even know from like yourself, Christopher, and other people that have applied for funding, even the application processes for these things are exclusive and difficult for people to access, and I think that I do think it disproportionately, like, once you've got your foot in the door and you've got a kind of network and people can help you out, then you'll succeed in that and it'll be sustainable for you. But for other people it won't be.
That's it.
Yeah, I don't want my musicians to be good at filling out forms and doing budgets.
Yeah.
I want my musicians to be good at music.
But that's what it is, though. That's what we're saying about the private education drift. It is
exactly
that they've got better lawyers, better agents, and a bigger safety net from their parents to enable them to persevere with it. And the whole landscape is changing. And I just think it's interesting that those people are now having to sweat, probably for the first time. Like, really, for the first time in a real way. I'm sorry it takes so much damage and loss to make people see the reality that other folks face all the time. And I just wish that we could emerge from this with the people who do get the funding, acknowledging how fucking hard it is for all the punk musicians and noise musicians and grime artists and hip hop artists and producers that are out there doing it simply because they love it, and they would do it whether they got paid or not. And to be a wee bit more fucking humble, and if they want to campaign for fair remuneration, campaign across the board. Just don't fucking campaign because it suits you and because you don't want to work in fucking Tesco, because some people work in Tesco and make art. Fucking deal with it.
Well, that's a good final line. Some people work in Tesco and make art. Deal with it. I've enjoyed that. Thanks very much. I think we've come to some conclusions.
Hopefully we didn't hemorrhage too many listeners there.
Fuck it.
Hot takes abound anyway. You can rely on us for that. We'll be back next week with the advertised episode on Wire's Pink Flag album, which is a belter and requires a lot of homework, guys, as I'm sure you noticed.
Yes, Christ.
Yes, I definitely have.
A really big thanks to Vicki for joining us. We'll
thank
have you
you.
back soon.
Thanks for inviting me back.
And I'm sure you'll give us loads of shit online in the meantime. And also, it was your choice for the Nexus for next week, Francisco Goya.
Was that my choice?
Yeah, that'll be a good one.
Cool.
Well, that's what the paper says.
Aye, some boy.
the Daily Mail. All right. Everybody travel safe.
Right. Be good.
I'm away busking. I can't believe we got through that, and that's the first time when the word busker got mentioned. Fucking hell.
God damn.
All right. Good night.
Good night.
Bye.
Good night, everybody.